Hello, and welcome to part one of what will be a three-part series as part of the CosTube collaboration Corsetry in Motion. In this first part, I will take you down the long and windy path that is the athletic corset. What are they? When did they originate? What is the history behind them? And who was wearing them? Part 2 will involve me taking you with me as I attempt to recreate an athletic corset based on extant examples, and Part 3 will involve me wearing this corset as I, a professional athlete and performer, go through my normal athletic routines. But first, before we get too deep, a few disclaimers. First, please excuse potato quality on some of the images I'm about to show. I'm working almost exclusively with primary sources, and not everyone scans in centuries-old documents with the highest of quality. If it bothers you, please consider a donation to archive.org, hathitrust.org, or the Library of Congress. And two, I am not a formally trained dress historian, nor do I have any sort of paid membership to some of the resources that, well, probably would have been very useful and made my research a bit faster and easier. That being said, I have a good head on my shoulders, and I have spent weeks combing through literally hundreds of primary sources on the topic. While I feel fairly well versed on the subject, I am by no means infallible, nor am I claiming to have grasped every last intricacy of the rich and complicated historical politics surrounding the issue of corsetry. If you believe I have made an error or that I have missed an aspect of the topic, you are welcome to let me know politely in the comments. Any gatekeeping, body shaming, bullying, or general nastiness will not be tolerated. Polite and well-researched counterpoints are, of course, welcome. To begin with, let's define the time frame and geographic locations that I will mainly be talking about. I will be focusing on the period from the 1880s through to the early Edwardian, although we will need to dip back a bit further in time to look at the events leading up to and setting the stage for the invention and proliferation of the athletic corset. I will also be focusing on the United States, as that's where most of my primary sources come from, although I have found evidence for athletic and health corsets being sold in Canada, Australia, Great Britain, and France. Mostly because those are the main languages I speak and can functionally use Google in. But unless otherwise stated, for the rest of this video, think USA between 1880 and 1910 or so. Next, let's define what an athletic corset was, or rather, what were some of the most common features of an athletic corset, because there were, as you can imagine, a multitude of different styles. So, the most common defining features of an athletic corset were: they had minimal boning, no boning, or bones that were removable. Usually, softer cording took the place of stiffer bones to keep the structure of the garment while allowing for more movement. They generally trade the busk in the front in favor of a strip of buttons for more flexibility. We'll take a more in-depth look at this system later as I start to recreate my own sports corset. They often had elastic panels on the sides and occasionally in the hip gores as well, again to allow for a wider range of movement. Some models, particularly those that were advertised for use with seated sports such as riding or cycling, were shorter in the front and the hips. And they nearly always had shoulder straps, usually adjustable with buttons or, in some cases, elastic straps. Now, this is not a comprehensive list of all the traits available. There were certainly some other features advertised, but these are the traits that are a common trend among the majority of athletic and health corsets. And this actually brings me to my next point. For the sake of this video, I will not only be looking at corsets which were specifically advertised as athletic corsets, but I will also be lumping in the subset of corsets which may not have been directly advertised for use while exercising, but which shared many of the same traits. Because, as we will see, at the same time that the athletic corset became popular, there was also a portion of the population that was moving towards having a lighter, looser, more flexible corset in general, thanks in part to the dress reform movement and in part to women's increased participation in sporting activities. These corsets share so many of the same traits as athletic corsets and often have such a substantial overlap in the terms that are being used to advertise them that I have decided to cover them all in this video, regardless of whether one was advertised specifically for use with sports and another wasn't. In that same train of thought, I want to touch briefly on the nomenclature of the subject. The list of terms I have found for these garments is extensive and includes health corset, health waist, sanitary corset, sanitary waist, hygienic corset, hygienic waist, bicycle corset, bicycle waist, bicycle corset waist, corded corsets or waists, athletic corsets or waists, sports corsets, riding corsets for horses and for bicycles, as well as a number of variations on corset substitutes, with one brand even calling itself the self-adjusting corset. So calling these garments corsets seems logical, but what's with the word waist? Well, the term waist was originally used to describe a garment that covered the body from the shoulders to the waist, especially the bodice of a woman's dress, whether separate from the skirt or joined to it. The term comes into use at least as far back as the 1860s and continues well into the 1900s. And because history is never neat or straightforward, we have to be careful because the usage of some of these terms, like the fashions they were describing, changed over the course of the years. Many garments meant for the torso had similar names, and copywriters weren't always careful to specify which garment they were talking about. So a waist in one article might refer to this, and in another to this, or one of these. One also needs to be sure to differentiate between a child's waist, alternatively called an underwaist or panty waist, and one meant for adults. Either way, when looking for a word to describe a corset alternative, it makes sense that designers and advertisers gravitated towards the term waist, or the hybrid corset waist. Either that, or they all had a personal vendetta against future dress historians who need to search through literal decades of archival material with specific keywords. We also have to be careful when we are researching corset waists that we are in fact talking about fabric undergarments and not potatoes. So although we see a big explosion of athletic and health corsets starting in the 1870s, the notion of a flexible undergarment meant to support without constricting was by no means a new concept. And I know I just said I'd be staying mostly in the USA, but for these early predecessors, we're going to jump back in time and across the pond. The earliest reference I found to an elasticated corset comes from the United Kingdom in 1802, it only having been called the United Kingdom for 1 year at that point, when I see references to something called the Curious Circassian, which was advertised as having elastic fronts. Now, elastic as we know it not having been invented until 1820, I'm guessing that the elastic here was probably in the form of a knitted fabric, possibly silk or cotton, or else woven and cut in a way that would give some stretch to the fabric. A later ad for this corset expounds on its virtues, claiming that the Circassian corset made, quote, without superfluities of steel, whalebone, or hard substances, are declared by physicians to be the only corset that should be worn, as they give ease, gracefulness, and dignity to the shape. Already with this first example, we're seeing people in the medical community recommending women's undergarments that promote ease of motion. This will become a recurring theme, as you'll see. 1 year later, in 1807, Her Majesty's staymaker Mrs. Harman is advertised as making stays that eliminate, quote, every objection complained about in stays, including the addition of knit gores so very elastic as to be, in effect, no stay. This ad from Dublin in 1836 advertises the choicest articles in the lingerie française, including the option for corsets with a demi-elastic front, a full elastic front, elastic shoulders, or, for ladies enceintes or pregnant women, with all of the above elastic additions, as well as elastic hip gores. So, only a few decades after that first elasticated corset, we are already seeing an increase in the quantity and options for elasticated corsets, as well as another trend that we'll see later in the health corsets, which is their promotion for use when pregnant. In 1837, and I'm quoting this primary source via Nora Waugh here, we have an advert for a new calisthenic corset, totally devoid of bone, in which young ladies can with ease perform the most difficult of calisthenic exercises. In 1844, we see mentions of a universally patronized corset, which advertises its elasticity and is particularly recommended to ladies accustomed to riding. This isn't the first time that we see corsets with modifications for riding. We have evidence for specific riding stays dating at least as far back as the 1770s, as seen in Denis Diderot's L'Encyclopédie, as well as this extant pair from the private collection of Mary Doring. Here, we potentially have an extant riding corset from 1820, although this comes with the big asterisk that I couldn't verify this information with the museum due to COVID. Modifications for riding were similar to some of the modifications of later sports corsets, specifically being lighter boned than normal and having hips that were higher cut and that could be unlaced for range of motion and comfort while sitting astride. However, as horseback riding was one of the only forms of formal exercise considered socially acceptable for women for many years, and that activity was restricted to the upper classes, there was no great need, or perhaps excuse, for the average woman to have a lighter, more mobile version of a corset. Enter the bicycle craze combined with the dress reform movement. Dress reform is an intensely complicated subject. The movement spanned over 50 years, its advocates weren't restricted by gender and included educators, feminists, physicians, artists, dancers, actresses, and members of religious groups, to name a few. They came from various backgrounds with multifaceted interests and a wide variety of solutions to what they each perceived to be the problems with women's clothing. It is a fascinating and intensely complicated subject that I can't hope to cover in detail in this video, so I will only be skimming the surface and summarizing the key points in this movement as they relate to our topic of corsetry. The main arguments of the dress reformers can be grouped into three categories. Political, that fashion and women's clothing directly limited women's roles and thus their potential for any real impact on society. Physical, that fashion was a detriment to women's health, both as a deterrent to exercise as well as physically injuring their bodies, especially through the practice of tight lacing. Aesthetic, that fashion, with its strange protrusions and unnatural silhouettes, went against the ideals of natural beauty and was therefore unattractive. We will mainly be looking at the argument that fashionable dress was unhealthy to a woman's body. Throughout the 19th century, and indeed into the early decades of the 20th, the basic fashionable silhouette for women went through many permutations. Carolina has a great summary of the various fashions here if you'd like a humorous refresher. These silhouettes were not dependent on the natural shape of the individual, but instead on a number of various undergarments, corsets, petticoats, bustles, bum pads, bust enhancers, crinolines, etc., to help achieve the fashionable look. While early dress reformers of the 1850s and 60s targeted the outer garments for reform, most notably Amelia Bloomer and her bifurcated trousers, those attempts for the most part fell flat, and so many later dress reformers sought instead to alter the undergarments, promoting a change towards the more hygienic and rational while keeping the outer dress more or less in compliance with the fashionable styles. This offered a middle road to many women who were concerned about their health but didn't want to go against societal norms or suggest that they have questionable morals. Because yes, the act of wearing pants could bring your morals into question or cost you a hefty fine. Just go ask Katie Strage. At least we can begin with the invisibilities and reform ourselves from within. If we succeed, the rest will follow. Advocates of this more moderate approach to dress reform, such as Annie Jeunesse Miller and Dr. J. H. Kellogg, devised entire dress systems, which were whole new sets of underclothing meant to reduce the number and weight of garments worn. Some of these eliminated the corset completely in the hopes of improving health and hygiene. These systems sought to leave the organs unimpeded, maintain a uniform body temperature, reduce weight of the outfit on the body, and spread that weight out along the shoulders and not solely the hips, all of which were key points of the dress reform argument. A look at the dress system Annie Janess Miller proposed circa 1888 illustrates this idea. This system included a union suit worn next to the body, a chemilette to replace the petticoat and chemise, leglets or a divided skirt and waist, and either a bosom support or a model bodice in place of a corset. The bosom support was entirely unboned, while the model bodice, seen closer in this ad from 1890, had some stiffening and bears a striking resemblance to the health and athletic corsets that were simultaneously gaining prominence. Lecturers and physicians who did not have their own dress systems to promote often promoted either the use of these dress systems already mentioned or the use of hygienic corsets. Almost universally, pregnant women were advised to either abandon the corset completely or to adopt far less rigid undergarments. For many of these lecturers, physicians in particular, the topic of dress reform was virtually inseparable from the issue of health. Compression of the waist, the layering on of heavy skirts and constrictive bodices and collars not only interfered with movement, it also discouraged women from physical activity at a time when exercise was increasingly being equated with beauty and good health. This quote from the book The Power and Beauty of Superb Womanhood illustrates beautifully this point. Author Bernard McFadden writes, "Any article of clothing which hinders the freedom of muscular movements or interferes even in the slightest degree with the circulation of blood has a weakening influence upon the body. Long skirts hang from the waistline and thus continually aid the corset in the deadly downward pressing process. They also interfere most seriously with muscular movement. One cannot walk or take active exercise with any degree of comfort or freedom while wearing such an article of clothing. Tight clothing of all kinds, tight waists, sleeves, etc., are objectionable and are baneful in their influences. Any article of clothing which increases the efforts necessary in moving the body is productive of injury." Now, I don't mean to imply that I believe that corsets are an article of torturous restriction, or that the wearing of them prevented women from going about their daily activities. In fact, the entire purpose of the Corsetry in Motion collaboration is to help challenge this exact stereotype. But I think there are a few things that we need to remember when we read the literature of the time. One is that they are not speaking out against corsets alone, but against the many layers of clothing layered upon the body, combined with the corset, in order to achieve the fashionable silhouette. The weight of these layers, which prior to the invention of the crinoline could be 12 to 14 pounds in petticoats alone, was copious. And speaking from the personal experience of someone who has spent the vast majority of my winters in weather that requires similar ponderous layers of clothing, that weight is definitely a deterrent to exercise. Combine that with a heavily boned supportive undergarment, and while I certainly won't be deterred from going about my necessary daily activities, I'm also not super eager to hop on a bike or pick up a tennis racket and work up a sweat without first shedding a lot of those layers. Fortunately, in 2021, it is socially acceptable for me to do so. However, if you are a physician in the late Victorian era and you are pushing for your patients to adopt a more active lifestyle, one of your biggest obstacles would naturally be the beautiful yet cumbersome fashions of the time, especially considering that most women were incredibly reluctant to deviate from those fashions. Constant corset use was correlated with the body becoming lazy, and strength of the boning, it was argued, replaced the strength of the abdominal muscles. Bernadette Banner has indeed spoken about the similar physical effects she had to deal with after years of using a back brace to combat her scoliosis, and the physicians of the time were noticing a similar effect. I'm pretty sure the phrase, "if you don't use it, you lose it," wasn't coined at the time, but if it had been, they would no doubt have adopted it as a talking point. At the same time that women were encouraged to adopt looser, more mobile clothing and undergarments, they were simultaneously being encouraged to get out and exercise, often in the same lecture or health pamphlet. And just as collegiate programs were really starting to develop and diversify women's athletic programs, and health advocates were pushing for increased physical activity for women, a technological advance was just around the corner that was about to open up the realm of physical activity to a wide range of socioeconomic classes: the bicycle. And that is where we will leave this video. Next week, I'll cover how the bicycling craze of the 1890s contributed to the proliferation of sports corsets. We'll take an in-depth look at the rise of one homegrown health corset company, and we'll consider whether this was a fashion fad reserved for the wealthy or if sports corsets were as popular as the advertisements suggest. If you enjoyed this first half of my deep dive, please consider giving the video a like and hitting the subscribe button so that you'll be notified when the second half is released. There should be a Google Doc with links to my sources down in the description if you'd like to peruse them for yourselves. Thoughtful corrections, kind words, and questions on things I didn't cover are welcome in the comments section. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.